discrimination. Why? People make assumptions even about white guys, right? And some of those assumptions are problematic. Every single woman in this room has had to deal with discrimination, right? Every single person of color has had to deal with discrimination. People who are bigger, right? Body type matters. We have discrimination of lots of forms, right? Ability, right? Suppose you're not able-bodied, right? Suppose you're not pretty enough. There's a ton of data on how discrimination works based on whether you're attractive, right? And you know this from student evals, right? If you're attractive, your student evals are significantly higher. Like, it's been measured. That's crazy. So many different things, right? Not just skin color, not just gender, not just sexuality, but are you good looking? Do you have a nice haircut? Things like that, right? So every single one of you has had to deal with some of the blowback, whether it's been the kind of discrimination that's hurt your life is unlikely. But that wasn't my question, right? All right, one more. I have participated in discrimination. All right, yay! So, there are like two people who think everyone from Temple rocks, but mostly that works. All right, we're going to move on. So, I'm going to talk to you now about a whole other layer to this, which is cultural and social challenges. Now, again, this isn't something, not all of these are going to directly be relevant in your classrooms, depending on where you teach, right? But the first concept is American exceptionalism, and that's just basically the idea that the United States is qualitatively different from other countries. And it's connected to the idea that it's also better, right? We're more democratic, we're more free, we're more just. Now, even if some of you may think that's not entirely true, some of you may think it is true, we actually have data that shows some of the strengths of our democracy and some of the flaws in it. Most people's feelings about their country aren't actually synced up with true data. For instance, our voter turnout is one of the lowest of a developed democracy. So you might argue that's not a good sign. We also have more money in our elections than many other countries, etc. But most people's feelings don't sync up with the data. Now, the reason why this matters is that it leads us to think about ourselves as better. It's the same sort of thing as the Penn State versus Temple thing. So, whether you are right about what you think makes your country better than others, it makes you put yourself in a position of superiority vis-a-vis someone from another country. And that can be very problematic when you're trying to teach people from other countries, right? Because you have assumptions about, say, someone from China, and you think it's a certain way there. And most importantly, though, it's not that you think it's different, you think it's not as good. So that, again, creates an issue of bias. But what you need to recognize, and this is something that's challenging for people who haven't traveled a lot, and that's that national pride is not unique to the United States, right? So nationalism, and we have American exceptionalism, but believe me, I've lived in lots of other countries, and I've pretty much never lived in a country that didn't think it was just better than everyone else. And that, you know, might blow your mind, but generally speaking, that's pretty true. Certainly the French think they're the best. But, you know, whether you're talking about Argentines, they're very proud of their country, right? South Africans, Chinese, it doesn't matter, right? So what I want you to recognize is that those issues of national pride can, again, get in the way of being able to have meaningful contact with people from other countries. Now, the other thing is Orientalism, and this is the famous photograph of the Afghan girl that was on the cover of National Geographic and taken by Penn State alum, Steve Spurgeon. Now, Orientalism is this idea that that we have a tendency also to compare cultures, in this case between the West and the East, right? But again, it's not just that the people from that culture are different, it's that they're not as good, right? So when we deal with conversations about what's happening, let's say, in Iraq, in Syria, or in Afghanistan, it's often the case that we attribute some of the problems over there to the people. There's something wrong with the people, okay? And this was especially true in Afghanistan after 9/11, when we had this strange conversation about how we were going to go save the Afghans from the Taliban, but the Afghans were bad people who we needed to get revenge from, even though there wasn't a single Afghan on any of the flights that day, right? Does anybody remember what nationality the majority of the people on those planes were? Saudi. We didn't go to war with Saudi Arabia. And the Taliban, I teach in international affairs. I just had a student yesterday in class in a presentation say, the Taliban took over Al-Qaeda. And I was like, no, they didn't. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist group that was training within Afghan borders, but Al-Qaeda spoke Arabic. Afghans speak Pashtun, which is sort of a version of Persian. It's like the difference between German and French. Okay, they don't even speak the same language. They're not taking over anything. And the Taliban they were not taking over anything. Anyway, so the point is that we have these ideas, right, that we were associating with an entire nation that then led us to make things make sense, right? So this decision makes sense. This outcome, well, we're not surprised it's still a mess over there because those Afghans, they're super unruly. They don't even understand what democracy is. The idea of folks being religious fanatics. So instead of looking at sort of the reality, we start using prejudice to explain things. So that's one reason why Orientalism is an issue for us, and it's not going to go away. I mean, wherever you are, whether you have people coming into your classrooms who are from these diverse cultures, or whether you have students coming into your classrooms talking about these issues, these are not going to go away in your lifetime, for sure. Now, culturalism, I'm sort of getting to this. Culturalism is the tendency to see the problems of other cultures as endemic, as a cultural trait, not a political problem. So that's important because it allows you to say what was happening, for instance, in Afghanistan wasn't a consequence of the fact that the country had been in a civil war for 30 years, where the United States and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were sending about $350 million of arms in regularly, annually. And then they go, well, but now look at them, they can't do anything right. At the time of 9/11, the capital of Afghanistan only had electricity 6% of the time. So you can say these people are totally barbaric, or you might say, how functional do you think a country can be when it doesn't have roads, schools, hospitals, electricity? So again, we have a tendency to kind of give these cultural explanations for political problems, right? And so that's something that is a big deal, and it really affects how we think about folks all over. It's, again, interesting to see like how we think about the way in which, say, the terrorist attacks in Paris happen versus terrorist attacks here in the United States, right? Because we've got both countries over the last few months dealt with some pretty terrible situations, right? Interestingly, we might start to think of the French as like, they're not doing a good job, right? So start to think about your assumptions, even that you're making about France, which of course is Europe, and we tend to, privilege Europe over the Central Asia. Now, one of the problems when we talk about racism, because again, you guys are coming into the classroom in the era of Black Lives Matter and a lot of issues that are directly related to race, is that we tend to have a complicated issue with race now since there's so much subtle racism, right? It's changed this election because we've gotten back into a lot of name calling, but generally speaking, we still have a lot of very subtle ways, like I was explaining to you, that we categorize people according to their race, right? It's extremely difficult to get your head out of those habits. So again, I want you to do, as opposed to going, I gotta stop being racist, it's being paying attention to it, right? So the concept of, so it used to be, the idea was, we were trying to teach people to be colorblind. Did anybody watch Stephen Colbert? He used to be like, I don't see race. He was joking about that, right? That when he'd say, oh, are you black? Because I can't see race. People tell me you're black, right? He was making a joke about the concept of being colorblind. You cannot be colorblind. You can't. So you need to learn to check your bias, right? That's what we want to teach now, not being colorblind, okay? Because it doesn't work. And then people get grouchy. People get very grouchy when they think that they're being unethical. It's interesting. So everyday race. So if you think about combating these ideas, it's a much more subtle process, right? So it's, what was the thing that I said? How did I do it? How can I change? So we have these everyday ways of othering. One of the things that's fascinating in this research is that if you meet someone once, you will remember the color of their skin, but not the color of their shirt. You could remember the color of their shirt. Why do you think you remember the color of their skin instead of the color of their shirt? So the point is, the brain is capable of recognizing and remembering a color connected to a person. Why do you think it's the skin color that you remember and not the shirt? Because the brain decides that the skin color is important information to remember. Not like, oh, this guy, he's the guy who wears the gray shirt. That's the gray shirt guy. That's what I'm going to remember. We remember the skin color because we think that's important. That's data I need to know about the person. So that's interesting. So one of the things you have to think about is how we have these everyday sort of, some people call them microaggressions, like casual ways. Like, so how many of you have had a time when you maybe talked about a friend and you're like, yeah, so my Chinese friend. You know, you don't have to feel, I mean, right? Or I have you might not say, I'm my black friend, right? You might not say that because you'd be awkward. But you might say Chinese. right? Because you don't think you're being racist, right? But you have to ask yourself, even when you say, interestingly, right? We might say, my gay friend, right? Or we might say, right, we label, we qualify the type of friend. And so it's worth stopping to think for a second, why would you do that? I mean, isn't the person just a friend? Is the information about that person as being from a different country or having a different sexuality or, right? Why is that even important? And most importantly, who says my white friend? I'm going to go hang out with my white friends tonight. Even black people don't say that, right? So you want to ask yourself, when do these words show up? The other thing we do is we ask people to report for a group, right? So I say, hey, Emily, what do white girls think about this? No, we don't do that because that's the dominant group, right? But if you're in a class and you're of Mexican descent,